right, so we're in journal 31 here, and we're going to start with the bell work where you're just trying to fill in the table and the missing spaces. So basically above each table gives you the equation, which is acting as basically the set of rules. So in this case, for the first one, here's our equation, and it looks like they give us the x values, which is kind of nice. So all we have to do to figure out y is just to plug them in and see what value we get for y. So like if you had to work it out and show all your work, you'd be plugging like this 0 in for x. So that'd be like 0 minus 4, which is negative 4. So my answer here would be that negative 4. And then I can do this for 1 minus 4. So I'm just plugging in 1 and I get negative 3. And then if I were to plug in 2 minus 4 gives me negative 2. I'll just circle these answers as I go. 3 minus 4 is negative 1. And I'm starting to see the pattern. Basically, everything's decreasing. Increasing by 1. So then this would be 4 minus 4, which gives us 0. And so we have now filled out this table. Some of you guys might be really clever and start to notice, well, it's increasing by 1, I'll just add by 1. And some people will even notice that the slope here is 1. So if the slope here is 1, that's also another way you can know that the number is going to be increasing by 1 every time. So quick tip. For B, you'll notice it's not in that nice, y equals mx plus b form. So this format is what we call the y-intercept format. And notice here it's not quite like that. The x's and y's are both on one side and then you have a constant. This is what we call standard form. When x's and y's are both on one side and then there's a constant on this side, it's what we call standard form. Although what we're trying to do here is figure out some x values and y values this time. So here's what I recommend. Some of you guys might, plug in 0 and then try to find y, or vice versa, plug in the value for y and then find x. Okay, you could do that. But what I like to do instead is just solve for x and y in the beginning, and then use that equation and plug in whatever x and y value that I have. It just makes it a little bit easier so that I don't have to solve for x or y both every time I plug in something. So here's what I mean. I'm going to take this equation, x minus y equals 3, and I'm going to first solve, for x. I'm going to try to get x by itself. So to do that, I have to add y to both sides, right? So then that means x comes down, and this is 3 plus y. And so now the question is, how do I get this x value? So if I have a y value, like this one, so I know that y is equal to, so if I want to figure out basically this missing x value, I could just plug in 0 for my y. How about I circle this answer so that way I don't lose it. So in this case, if I plug in 0 for my y, add that with 3, my answer is 3, right? 3 plus 0 equals 3. So that's what I'm saying. And then if I want to figure out what y is, all I have to do is maybe first solve the equation for y and then use that to plug in any x values that I might have. So I'm going to just grab the equation again, but this time I'm going to solve for y. So the first thing I might want to do is maybe move this x over so I can start getting the y by itself. So maybe subtract x to both sides. Bring down the negative y. 3 and x don't combine, so you're just going to bring it down as it is. Now, there is this negative in front of y, so we do need to get rid of a negative, and to do that, we always divide by a negative. But when you do that, you'll need to divide it to both, to the other side, to both terms. So every term on the other side will get divided by negative 1, which is not too bad, so just stick with me. So the negatives cancel on the left-hand side, y comes down, so now y is by itself. 3 divided by negative 1 is negative 3. Negative divided by a negative is a positive, and then x comes down. And here's my equation. Basically, to get y, I'm just going to be adding it with negative 3. So the first one here is 0, right? I have x equals 0. So if I plug in 0 into here, add that with -3, I just get -3. If I plug in 5 for x, 5 plus -3 is +2. And if I plug in 2 in for this x, 2 plus -3 gives me -1. And now I have filled out my chart. And so that's what exactly I'm going to do for the third one here. So just to do this for extra practice, I would pause here and try to do it on your own before you see the results. So that way you can try to do this independently. All right, so I'm going to work this problem out. So this one here is my equation. Just like I did before, I'm going to try to solve for x and y first. So I'm going to grab that equation, bring it down. To get x by itself, looks like you have to subtract by 2y to both sides. So that means I now have an x equals 5 minus 2y, and now x is by itself. So if I have a y value, like this one here, if I want to figure out this x value, I have to plug in 0 for my y. Well, if I plug in 0 into here, I'll kind of write this out so that way you guys can see. That would be x equals 5 minus 2 times 0. That means that this would cancel out and x is just equal to 5. So in this case, this would just be 5. If I were to plug in 2 into here, that would be 2 times 2, which is 4. So 5 minus 4 would give me 1. And there we go. Then we need to figure out what y is. So now I'm going to take that equation from the beginning and solve for y. So if I subtract x to both sides to try to starting to get this y by itself, 2y comes down, 5 minus x drops down, and then I'm just dividing 2 to both sides. Make sure you divide it to each of the terms. Y comes down, and so I have 5 divided by 2 minus x divided by 2, or 5 over 2 minus x over 2. Now I'm going to keep them as fractions because remember the goal is just to plug in the x value. So this first one here, how about I write it out this time so that way you guys can see. If I were to follow this equation, I'm plugging this 0 in for that x. So what that's going to look like is basically 5 divided by 2 minus 0 divided by 2, right? All I did was take this equation, plug in 0 in for this x. And here it is. Well, if I work this out, 0 divided by 2 is just 0. So that's going to cancel, leaving me with just 5 over 2. Or some of you guys might just write it as, what's 5 divided by 2? 2.5, right? So you can also write it as 2.5 if you like. So if I were to do it again for plugging in 2, so I'm going to plug in 2 for this equation. If I wrote that out, this would be 5 over 2 minus 2 over 2. Now, because both of the fraction have the same denominator, you can actually subtract the numerators. So 5 minus 2 gives me 3. 3 divided by 2, well, that's about 1.5, but I'm just going to keep it as a fraction. I'll take fractions or I'll take decimals. Either way, I'm fine. But that's basically it. Now I have filled out every single chart. So basically, when one variable solved for you, it's pretty easy because you just get to plug in the stuff and then figure out your other variable. When the x and y is not already solved, then you have to go solve for it and then plug in the x or y values that you already have to solve for the other one. So now let's move on to graphing lines, which is not anything new. It's going to feel much like review, but it's nice to refresh on those old skills. Okay, so graphing lines. When we're graphing a line on a coordinate system, typically you need at least 2 points to graph a line, right? Because you need 2 dots, 2 points to connect the dots to make a line, is essentially what we're getting at. When you plug in x equals 0 into an equation, you actually help find the y-intercept. So if you want to find the y-intercept, you got to plug in 0 for the x value. If you want to find the x-intercept, that's when you plug in y for 0 into y and find the x-intercept. So it's like the opposite of what you would think. So in the next slide here, we're going to do some examples where we're finding x and y-intercepts and also graphing a line. All right, so to find some x and y intercepts, we need to start by plugging in 0 for either x or y. So I'm going to just start us off with finding the x-intercept. So whenever I want to find an x-intercept, remember we need to plug in 0 for our y value, and then so we can find the x value. So here I go. If I'm doing this, it's going to be 2x plus 3 times 0 equals 12. So then the 0 and 3 will cancel because 0 times anything is 0. 2x comes down, 12 drops down, so then I just have to divide by 2. And that gives me x equals 6 if I just divide that 12 by 2. So 1 down. And remember, intercepts are points. So I can graph this point at 6, 0, which would be right here. And then our y-intercept is when we plug in 0 for x and find our y value. So I'm going to do that down here. So taking the same equation, this time I'm going to plug in 0 for my x. So that means that the 2 will cancel since 0 times 2 gives you 0. 3y comes down. And then I just have to divide by 3 on both sides to cancel that and make y by itself. So 12 divided by 3 gives me 4. So in this case, I have a 0, 4, which is up here. And now I just have to connect the dots. So remember, when we have 2 points, hint, hint, basically use your x and y intercepts. Plot those 2 points, you can connect the dots to make that line. So let's try that one more time with number 38 from the homework. By the way, I don't think I mentioned, these problems are straight from the homework problems that are optional for you. So I'm picking out problems from your textbook, so that way you guys get to do some of the homework problems in class, so you get kind of a taste of what we're trying to learn, and we get to practice those skills together. But if you feel like you would like to do some more more problems to practice, then check out these problems on your textbook. By the way, your textbook is basically a Google Doc, and you can find it on the Google Classroom. Just look for chapter 3.1 homework problems. You can find that on the spreadsheet on my Google Doc, or you could just find it in the Google Classroom if you just scroll to that section where it says homework problems or textbook problems. All right, so back to 38. I would like you guys to try it on your own first and then come back, like pause this video and then come back to check on your answer. So I'm going to work out 38. So I'm going to start by finding maybe the x-intercept, where I'm finding the x value when I plug in 0 for my y. So I'm going to plug in 0 for my y. That cancels again because anything multiplied by 0 cancels or becomes a 0. So then it looks like I'm dividing by 5 to get rid of that 5 on that x. So x is actually equal to 2. So my x-intercept is 2, 0. And so that puts it about right there. And then for my y-intercept, that's when I'm plugging 0 for x and finding my y value. So again, take the equation, plug in 0 for x this time. And so that cancels. 2y drops down, 10 drops down, divide by 2, and that gives me y equals 5. And so my y-intercept is 0, 5, which is up here. Yeah, it's a little bit taller. And so now I have 2 points, which I can connect the dots and make my line. And that's it. So hopefully this is a nice refresher on how you can graph lines using x and y intercepts. So one more concept to go. I do want to go over something called a midpoint and how do you find a midpoint. All right, the midpoint formula here. Before I get into this nitty-gritty formula, I want to explain how it works and how it come about. So I want us to imagine together, basically there are 2 points in space. You have 2 endpoints of a line. So let's call this point 1 and point 2. And you guys know that points naturally have coordinate points, so they have an x value and a y value. So I'll call this, I'll call this x1 and y1, and I'll call this x2 and y2. And so in this case, when we have 2 points, we can always form a line when we connect the dots. Sorry, that was not a very good straight line. I'll try it again. There we go. That looks better. So what the question is if you had to look for the halfway point of this line segment, so basically let's pretend that right here is the middle, or the midpoint is what we call it. How do you do it, right? And one way we can look at this is basically, well, because this is the halfway point, we know the x and the y values distance. So from this x value to that x value, I could add both of them up. So if I want to get from this x value to that, I'd add both of them up. And then if I want to know the midpoint, I would just half it. And so this is where that comes about. So the midpoint is also a coordinate system where you take the x values and you add them up and then divide by 2. And you'll also do that for the y values. So you would add up the y values and then divide by 2. So this is where the formula comes about. So this will be very helpful for you guys when you're solving for the midpoint if you're given 2 endpoints. So here are 2 endpoints that we're given. We need to figure out what's the midpoint. So given that, that means that, this is my x value, this is my x value. X's always come first. And so here's my y value. So if I were to use this formula, I would have, let's see, I'm just going to set it up first, divide by 2. So it looks like I have -8 added with -2. -8 added with -2. And then I have 4 plus -6. So basically all I did was plug in the x's into this equation and the y's into this equation. And now I'm going to simplify. So it looks like -8 added with -2 gives you -10 divided by 2. And 4 plus -6 gives you -2 over 2. So if you divide your answer or try to reduce it down, -10 divided by 2 is -5. -2 divided by 2 gives you -1. And here is our midpoint. So pretty easy. All you got to do is plug in your x's and y's. So see if you can try out that one. So I would pause the video, try out 56. All right, so I'm going to now work out these 2 endpoints to figure out the midpoint. So again, I'm just going to set this up how I did before. I know I'm dividing by 2. I'm going to be adding the x's and y's. So my x values here are 5 and -1, and my y values here are 2 and 8. So in this scenario, I have 5 plus -1, which is a 4 divided by 2. And then I have a 2 plus 8, which is 10. 10 divided by 2. So 4 divided by 2 is 2. 10 divided by 2 is 5. And now I have my midpoint. And that's it. So, like I said, if you're having a hard time with these problems, I would definitely try to practice some more problems in the textbook that are assigned and recommended if you want to try those out. And that's basically it for this video. Hope this helps.